Hello, friends. Imagine yourself in the 1860s, when the world you knew was on the brink of change. The distant echoes of battles reach your ears. But today we will talk not only about heroic deeds or great victories and losses. We will focus on the lives of ordinary people, soldiers who fought in the trenches, marched along endless roads under the scorching sun, balancing between duty and despair. Before we begin, I would like to ask for your support. If you like our journey into the past, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment under the video. Perhaps your relatives participated in this war, and you would like to share their stories. We are very interested in hearing your thoughts, as it makes our story even closer to our hearts. Make yourself comfortable and let the rhythm of the past gently lull you. Feel the weight of history in the quiet moments as we tell the stories of soldiers on both sides. Those who endured the harshest conditions, fought disease, fear, and loss for the cause they believed in. Their world was full of tension, hardship, and struggle, but also humanity and hope. Today, we will learn what it meant to be a soldier in this turbulent era. This journey will unfold over 2 hours, each moment revealing new facets of war, from everyday life in the camps to the secrets of long-lost stories. Imagine yourself in their shoes, wearing worn-out boots, feeling the weight of their hardships and the depth of their sacrifices. But let it be a gentle journey. If your thoughts begin to wander, that's okay. Let the past envelop you like a warm memory. Ready? Then let's begin. You are one of the many Union soldiers, part of the vast army that stretches across miles of terrain, preparing for another day of hardships. It's early morning, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of iron from the weapons at your side. The day begins not with a quiet breakfast, but with a long, hard march. You can hear the shuffling of feet, the faint calls of fellow soldiers, and the groaning of wagons creaking as they roll over the uneven path. Each soldier wears a uniform, but not the sharp, proud attire you might expect from the portraits you've seen. No, this uniform is tattered from constant use, streaked with dust, stained by sweat, and torn from the constant movement through brush, mud, and battlefields. The wool feels heavy against your skin, sticky in the summer heat and chill in the cold. The shoes pinch at your feet, and the rucksack on your back seems to grow heavier with every step. Breakfast is simple, perhaps a piece of hardtack, dry and crumbly, and a small portion of salted meat, too tough to chew easily. You drink from your canteen, the water still warm from the heat of the day before. The food is necessary, but not satisfying. The hunger never truly leaves you, a constant companion on this journey. As you march, you can't help but notice the fatigue that weighs down your comrades. Many are barefoot, their shoes long worn through by the constant marches. The dirt beneath your feet is thick, clinging to your boots as you move, a grim reminder of the conditions you endure. Every step feels heavy, but the pace never slows. The soldiers around you exchange quiet words, but there's little room for camaraderie. Everyone is too tired to speak much. Instead, the rhythm of marching fills the silence. The days blur into one another. The hours spent marching stretch on endlessly, interrupted only by brief stops to rest or drink. When you finally stop for the night, the encampment is set up quickly. Tents are pitched hastily, and the ground beneath you is uneven, hard, and unforgiving. The noise of soldiers settling in for the night is constant, men murmuring in their sleep, the rustle of blankets, the creaking of canvas. The air is thick with the scent of damp wool and the faint odor of unwashed bodies. Nightfall brings a brief moment of respite, but it is far from peaceful. The sounds of distant gunfire might echo in the distance, a reminder that the war is never far away. Sleep comes in fits, restless and fleeting. The ground beneath you feels hard, and the cold nips at your skin, making it nearly impossible to sleep soundly. And yet, tomorrow, the same routine will begin again, another day of marching, another day of surviving. Despite the discomforts, the soldiers find moments of reflection, though these are few and far between. Perhaps you think of home, if you have one, or the family you left behind. Maybe you imagine the life that once was, before the war took you from your quiet existence. The war, it seems, stretches out before you endlessly, with no clear end in sight. But for now, as the night settles in around you, the rhythm of the world feels constant, like a lullaby, steady, ever-present, and relentless. In this moment, sleep beckons, and you close your eyes, allowing the exhaustion to take over, knowing that tomorrow the march will begin again. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, stood at the center of it all. His leadership was not one of flashy speeches or dramatic victories. Instead, it was quiet, steady, and often weighed down by doubt. He carried with him the knowledge that his decisions, every choice, every word, would shape the future of the nation and affect the lives of millions, including your own. As you sit by your campfire, the flicker of the flames illuminating the pages of history, Lincoln's journey unfolds in the back of your mind. In the early days of the Civil War, Lincoln's path was anything but clear. His decision to preserve the Union was driven not by a desire for power, but by a profound belief in the enduring strength of the nation. The conflict, for him, was a matter of survival, not just for the Union, but for the very ideals upon which the United States was founded. He faced immense pressure from both sides, from those who wanted to compromise and avoid war to those who wanted to abolish slavery immediately. As you march along the long, dusty roads, you might think about the heavy toll this internal war took on Lincoln. In private moments, he wrestled with the crushing weight of grief, loss, and uncertainty. The battles you fight on the front lines are mirrored by his own internal battles, where the decisions of war are just as real, just as life-altering. His personal losses, including the death of his son Willie, often found their way into his work, his sorrow quietly seeping into his letters and speeches. Yet, Lincoln's resolve never faltered. He knew that his decisions, whether in signing the Emancipation Proclamation or choosing generals, would change the course of history. The proclamation, issued in 1863, was a moment of profound change, not just politically, but morally. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be set free. It was a bold move, one that turned the tide of the war, turning a fight for Union preservation into a moral crusade against the scourge of slavery. Lincoln's relationship with his generals was one of deep complexity. His struggle to find the right leaders to command the Union Army was evident. Figures like General George McClellan, who lacked the decisiveness Lincoln needed, and General Ulysses S. Grant, who became Lincoln's trusted leader, shaped the war's trajectory. Lincoln's willingness to change commanders until he found the right one was not a sign of weakness but rather a reflection of his unwavering commitment to achieving victory, no matter the cost. The weight of Lincoln's decisions often led him to seek solace in solitude. You might imagine him, sitting at his desk late into the night, candlelight flickering softly as he pored over reports from the battlefield, reading the letters of soldiers like you, trying to understand their needs and experiences. He was a man of deep empathy, but also of great endurance, carrying the responsibility of millions while trying to maintain his own humanity. As you stand on the battlefield, the distant sounds of cannon fire reaching your ears, the contrast between the hard realities of war and Lincoln's high-stakes decisions is stark. While you may struggle with the physical exhaustion of the day, Lincoln grappled with something equally draining, the intellectual and emotional toll of guiding a nation through its darkest hour. In the quieter moments of your march, as the wind rustles through the trees, you might wonder how many soldiers, like yourself, pondered the course of the war, thought about the president's role in it, or even understood the weight of his leadership. He is far removed from you, in Washington, but his actions echo in every step you take, every battle fought, every hardship endured. The Union Army, though separated by great distances, is bound together by the resolve Lincoln instilled, a resolve that holds firm in the face of constant adversity. The war rages on, and Lincoln, too, must continue, with the cost of victory in his mind, costs that will be paid not only by the soldiers on the front lines but by the families, by the very soul of the nation itself. Through every hardship you endure, through every painful march, remember that the fate of the Union rests on his shoulders, and he, like you, is carrying the weight of the future. Imagine yourself standing on the very ground where battles were fought, where soldiers like you once marched and camped. Beneath your feet, the soil holds secrets, items long forgotten, waiting to be discovered. The search for Civil War-era artifacts has been an ongoing journey for historians and archaeologists alike. These objects, once mere tools or personal possessions, have become time capsules that offer us a glimpse into the lives of those who lived through the war. From the simplest musket balls to the more intimate belongings of soldiers, these artifacts speak not only of war, but of the daily lives of the men who fought in it. As you reflect on your role in this war, consider the small but significant pieces that soldiers carried with them. A rusted button from a uniform, a torn letter from home, a pocket watch passed down from a father, or a well-worn Bible, all are more than just relics. They are echoes of lives once lived. These small items, often found in the most unexpected places, are the keys that unlock forgotten histories. Imagine an archaeologist carefully digging through the layers of earth on a battlefield site. With each shovelful of dirt, they uncover fragments of a world long past. A soldier's belt buckle, worn and weathered by the years, might tell a story of hardship and survival. A brass cartridge case, now faded and dented, once held the ammunition that could have meant the difference between life and death on that fateful day. These items offer a tactile connection to the past, a bridge between you, the modern listener, and the soldiers who stood where you now imagine yourself. One of the most iconic discoveries is the musket ball. Simple in appearance, yet it speaks volumes about the violence and fear of battle. These small, lead projectiles were responsible for many of the casualties of the war. As you hold one in your hand, if only in your imagination, you can almost feel the weight of the soldier's fear and the urgency with which it was fired. These musket balls, though once part of a deadly weapon, are now reminders of a time when life was fragile and uncertain. Equally intriguing are the letters and diaries that have been found over the years. These written artifacts provide a window into the soldier's world, revealing their hopes, fears, and reflections. Imagine yourself sitting at a small campfire, as a soldier writes home to his family, his pen scratching out words on fragile paper, knowing it might be the last letter he ever writes. His words are filled with longing, yet also a grim acceptance of the reality around him. These letters often tell of the mundane aspects of soldier life, damp tents, poor food, and the exhaustion of endless marching, but they also reveal the deep emotional strain of the war, the separation from loved ones, and the uncertainty of survival. In some cases, soldiers even wrote on the backs of their enemy's currency, using whatever scraps of paper they could find. These makeshift pages, though simple, become incredibly poignant when discovered today, as they represent not just the physical act of writing, but the soldier's connection to a larger purpose, his desire to communicate, to preserve his humanity amidst the chaos. The currency itself, marked by the scars of time, hints at a world long gone. The Confederate money, once a symbol of a cause, now a faded reminder of a war that tore the nation apart. There are also the personal items soldiers carried for comfort or practicality: pocket watches, folding knives, and even small photographs of loved ones. These items, though not as dramatic as the larger aspects of war, are just as telling. They remind us that soldiers, despite being caught in the horrors of war, were still human beings with personal connections, memories, and desires. The simple act of holding a photograph of a loved one in your hand during battle, imagining that you might be separated from them forever, speaks to the universal emotions of love, fear, and hope that transcend time. But perhaps most haunting of all are the graves of unknown soldiers, where no name is left to mark the life that was lost. Archaeologists and historians have been working tirelessly to identify these lost soldiers, often using DNA testing or forensic methods to match them with their families. The search for these soldiers, whose identities were lost to history, is a reminder of the vast number of individuals who went unnoticed, whose stories were never fully told. These individuals, though they have no names, are as much a part of the history of the Civil War as any general or politician. While the world of soldiers is harsh and grueling, the lives of those at home were, in many ways, just as difficult. For the families of soldiers, the war was a constant presence, a weight that hung over their everyday lives. Their struggle was not one of marches and battles, but of waiting, surviving, and holding on to hope while loved ones fought far away. Imagine the quiet stillness of a home where the usual sounds of laughter, conversation, and the rustling of daily life have been replaced by an unsettling silence. Wives, mothers, and children, their lives turned upside down, spent their days trying to carry on, unsure of what each day would bring. The men they loved were off at war, often out of contact for long stretches of time, with no certainty of when, or if, they would return. Life for these families was not easy. The absence of the father, brother, or husband was not only emotionally taxing but also financially crippling. In the absence of the male breadwinner, many women took on the responsibility of managing the household, often running small farms or businesses. This shift was both a necessity and a tremendous burden. Women found themselves stepping into roles that were traditionally held by men, learning new skills, and managing every aspect of daily life without the support they had once known. For mothers, the war was particularly painful. They sent their sons off to fight, often with heavy hearts, knowing that the likelihood of seeing them again was uncertain at best. The letters that arrived, if they arrived, were treasured, often read over and over again, their words offering a fragile connection to the one they loved. But for many, those letters were the last communication they would ever receive. The emotional toll on wives and mothers was immense. As you sit in your camp, the wind rustling the trees, you might imagine the quiet dread that must have gripped these women as they lived in a constant state of fear. Every knock on the door, every messenger with a letter, might be carrying news of death or injury. Imagine the anxiety that settled in with every passing day, the fear that one letter, one message, might bring with it the news of a son, a husband, or a brother lost forever. But amidst the grief and uncertainty, there were moments of resilience and hope. Some women, determined to contribute to the war effort, took on jobs as nurses, seamstresses, or even spies, doing their part in the fight for the Union. The lives of these women were as filled with hardship as the soldiers' lives on the battlefield. They too faced the brutality of war, witnessing the horrors of hospitals, tending to the wounded and the dying, and enduring the stress of living in a country torn apart by conflict. For children, the war meant a world without fathers. Boys grew up too quickly, forced to take on responsibilities they weren't ready for, while girls learned how to manage households and businesses at an early age. Their lives, once filled with the normal rhythms of childhood, were marked by the absence of their fathers and the fear of what the future might bring. The emotional landscape of the homefront was one of constant waiting and worrying. While soldiers endured the physical hardships of war, their families endured the emotional and psychological toll. Women's lives were deeply affected by the war, not just by the loss of their husbands or sons but by the strain of holding together homes that were under constant stress. They had to be strong, not just for themselves, but for their children, for their communities. The weight of this burden, much like the weight of your own pack, was invisible, but no less real. Despite the hardships, these families carried on, each day taking one step forward, hoping that their loved ones would return home. Letters from the front lines, though rare, were eagerly awaited, bringing moments of comfort. When they came, those letters were read aloud, cherished, and passed around the family. The words were small pieces of a loved one's world, small fragments of normalcy in a time that had little room for it. For many families, the war also brought a sense of pride. The struggle for the Union, the fight to abolish slavery, was something they could believe in. The sacrifices of the men fighting were not without meaning. Even as they suffered, there was a sense that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that could reshape the future of the nation. This was a time of profound change, not just for the soldiers, but for those waiting at home, whose lives were forever altered by the war. In the early years of the war, the Union struggled to find a general who could both command the army and truly understand the vast scope of the conflict. The war, now stretching into its third year, seemed to be an endless cycle of indecision, missed opportunities, and costly failures. But then came Ulysses S. Grant, a figure whose calm determination and relentless pursuit of victory would shift the tides of the war, leading the Union to its ultimate triumph. Grant's rise was not a glamorous one. In fact, when he was first appointed to command the Union Army, his career had already been marked by failure. Before the war, Grant had served in the U.S. Army, but after his resignation, he struggled to find success in civilian life. He tried his hand at various businesses, including farming and selling goods, but found little success. Grant, however, was not one to be easily discouraged. His resolve remained unbroken, and when the war broke out, he rejoined the military. His experience in the Mexican-American War had prepared him for the discipline and strategic thinking required in battle, and soon, his leadership would become the Union's greatest strength. At the beginning of his command, Grant's strategy was simple: be relentless. He was not one to shy away from confrontation or hesitation. While other generals focused on protecting territory and securing small victories, Grant recognized that the key to Union success was not in securing temporary advantages, but in constant pressure on the enemy. He sought to wear down the Confederacy, never giving them the chance to regroup or recover. One of Grant's earliest successes came at the Battle of Fort Donelson in 1862. The fort, held by Confederate forces, was a crucial point on the Union's strategic path through the South. Grant, commanding an army with fewer soldiers than the Confederate defenders, managed to surround the fort, forcing the Confederates to surrender. Grant's famous demand for unconditional surrender earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, a title that both struck fear into his enemies and solidified his reputation among the Union troops. As you sit here now, far from the battlefields, you might imagine Grant's leadership during those early days. His decisions, often marked by a calm, almost stoic demeanor, helped shape the future of the war. He faced criticism at times, particularly from political figures and military officers who believed his aggressive tactics were too risky. Yet Grant's focus remained clear. The war would be won not by avoiding conflict, but by continually pressing the Confederacy from every angle, stretching their resources thin, and forcing them into a war of attrition. Perhaps one of the most notable aspects of Grant's leadership was his ability to work in concert with President Abraham Lincoln. While other Union generals faltered, Grant formed a strong partnership with Lincoln, who recognized his understanding of the war's larger objectives. Unlike many of his predecessors, Grant was willing to engage in decisive, large-scale campaigns. He believed in pushing forward, even at great cost, with the belief that victory was within reach if only the Union Army could continue the fight. Grant's greatest test came with his campaign against General Robert E. Lee in 1864, when he took command of the Army of the Potomac. The war, by now, had dragged on for years, and the Confederacy was weakening. But Lee's forces were still formidable, and the road to victory was far from guaranteed. Grant's strategy was simple yet brutal: a war of attrition. He knew that the Union, with its larger population and greater resources, could outlast the Confederacy. But it would require constant pressure, endless marches, and fierce battles. He was willing to endure significant losses to achieve that end, a decision that would both define his leadership and stir controversy. The Overland Campaign, launched by Grant in May 1864, was a testament to his resolve. The battles fought during this campaign, at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, were marked by heavy casualties on both sides. Yet, unlike his predecessors, Grant refused to retreat. He simply kept moving forward, inching closer to Lee's stronghold in Richmond, the Confederate capital. His strategy was unwavering, a march towards victory that would not be deterred by setbacks or the cost in lives. As you sit under the night sky, the faintest breeze brushing past you, you might think of the contrast between Grant's approach and that of his opponents. Lee, for all his tactical brilliance, had fewer resources, and the South's ability to continue the war was rapidly diminishing. Grant, by contrast, had the full weight of the Union's resources at his disposal: men, supplies, and industry, and he was determined to use them to their fullest extent. The final chapter of Grant's military leadership came in April 1865, at the Appomattox Courthouse. After months of relentless pressure, General Lee, now exhausted and cornered, finally surrendered to Grant. The terms of surrender were generous, reflecting Grant's understanding of the need to heal the nation. He allowed Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses, their dignity intact, signaling the Union's commitment to reconciliation. For Grant, the victory was bittersweet. He had led the Union to victory, but at a great cost. The war had claimed the lives of over 600,000 soldiers, and the emotional toll weighed heavily on him. Yet, his leadership and strategic vision had been instrumental in bringing the conflict to an end. His success was not just in his ability to win battles, but in his understanding of the larger goal: to preserve the Union, to end the war, and to move the nation forward. You might find yourself lost in thought about one of the most pivotal moments in the American Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg. This battle, fought over 3 days in July 1863, is considered a turning point in the war. It marked the high-water mark of the Confederacy's advance into Union territory and resulted in a devastating loss for General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. But even now, over a century and a half later, Gettysburg remains shrouded in mystery, with unanswered questions and countless theories about what truly transpired on those hallowed fields. Imagine yourself standing on the rolling hills of Gettysburg, the very land beneath you marked by the weight of history. The air is still, and the wind carries the faintest whisper of what once transpired here. The fields, now peaceful and verdant, were once the scene of chaos: cannon fire, the cries of soldiers, the thunderous charge of cavalry, and the eerie stillness of the dead. The battle itself was brutal, and its aftermath left deep scars, both physical and emotional, on the land and its people. On July 1, 1863, the battle began unexpectedly. Confederate forces under General Lee encountered Union forces commanded by General George G. Meade. What followed was a fierce struggle, fought in small towns, fields, and forests, where soldiers, exhausted and bloodied, faced off in the most grueling of conditions. By the end of the third day, the Union had emerged victorious, but at a tremendous cost. Over 50,000 soldiers from both sides were killed, wounded, or captured, making it the bloodiest battle of the war. Despite the clear Union victory, the mysteries of Gettysburg remain. One of the greatest unresolved questions is about the battle's significance. Many historians agree that the Union victory at Gettysburg, combined with the fall of Vicksburg just days later, marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Yet, some argue that the Confederacy could have won, had Lee made different tactical decisions. What if he had not ordered the ill-fated Pickett's charge on the third day? Would the outcome have been different? Pickett's charge is one of the most iconic moments of the battle, and its failure is often viewed as a crucial turning point. General George Pickett, leading a division of Confederate troops, made a direct assault on the center of the Union line at Cemetery Ridge. The charge was met with heavy artillery fire, and the Confederate forces were devastated. Many historians have criticized the charge as a reckless decision, one that cost the Confederacy dearly. But there are lingering questions about Lee's intentions. Was he fully aware of the risks, or did he believe that a decisive blow would break the Union lines? Could the Confederacy have won the battle had Pickett's charge been executed differently? These questions remain unanswered, shrouding Gettysburg in a sense of lingering uncertainty. Another mystery of Gettysburg is the story of the high-water mark itself, the point at which the Confederate forces reached their furthest advance. This symbolic moment is often portrayed as the climax of the battle, when the Confederacy came closest to victory. But the question remains, was it really the closest the Confederacy ever came? Some historians believe that Lee's army was already stretched too thin and had no chance of sustaining its offensive beyond that point. Could Lee have pressed on, or had the battle already been decided by the time the Confederate forces reached Cemetery Ridge? The answers to these questions continue to elude us, even as historians debate the finer details of the conflict. The aftermath of the battle also raises its own set of mysteries. In the wake of the conflict, the town of Gettysburg was left in ruins. Thousands of bodies littered the battlefield, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air. The town itself was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the loss. Families from both sides were left to mourn their dead, many of whom would never be properly identified. The struggle to bury the dead and care for the wounded turned Gettysburg into a place of profound sorrow, but it also became a place of reflection and remembrance. The Gettysburg National Cemetery, where President Lincoln would deliver his famous Gettysburg Address later that year, stands as a reminder of the lives lost and the sacrifice made by those who fought here. There are also haunting stories surrounding the battlefield itself. Over the years, visitors to Gettysburg have reported eerie encounters, sightings of soldiers in period uniform, ghostly figures on horseback, and the sounds of distant battle. The supernatural presence of Gettysburg has become part of its legend, adding to the mystique of the place. Some claim to have seen figures of soldiers walking among the trees, while others have reported hearing cannon fire and the cries of soldiers. Whether these experiences are the result of the mind playing tricks or something more unexplained, they contribute to the lasting sense of unease that surrounds the battlefield. As you stand on the quiet grounds of Gettysburg, the landscape now calm and peaceful, you might feel a deep sense of reverence. The mysteries of the battle, the decisions made, the lives lost, and the lingering questions about what could have been, are part of the complex tapestry of the war. Gettysburg is not just a place of military importance, it is a place where the echoes of the past still resonate, where the weight of history presses down on the present. The unanswered questions about this battle, like so many others from the war, remain a part of the ongoing narrative of the Civil War, a narrative that, much like the war itself, is still being written and debated. The battle may have ended over 150 years ago, but Gettysburg continues to hold secrets. It's easy to think of the men who led the armies, the generals, the officers, those who made the decisions that affected the fate of thousands. While you and your fellow soldiers endure the hardships of life in the trenches, their lives seem, on the surface, to be far removed from the suffering of those beneath them. And yet, the realities of command, while different, carry their own burdens. Imagine yourself as one of the officers on either side of the conflict, dressed in the crisp uniforms of the Union or the Confederacy, sitting at a polished desk, writing orders that will determine the course of the war. Your quarters, though more comfortable than those of the rank-and-file soldiers, are far from luxurious. You might sleep on a cot, under a blanket of wool, but the nights are cold, and the campfires outside are no less harsh. The meals are more plentiful, but still lack the warmth of a home-cooked meal. The duties you face, while far removed from the physical struggle of battle, weigh heavily on your shoulders, as every decision you make could mean the lives of hundreds, if not thousands. The officers of the Union and Confederate armies were not just leaders. They were men who had to maintain order, morale, and discipline among their troops. They were responsible for orchestrating the strategies that would lead to victory or defeat, and yet, their own personal lives were often filled with the same uncertainties and tragedies faced by the common soldier. General Robert E. Lee, for example, the revered commander of the Confederate Army, had the same fears and frustrations as the men under his command. He, too, faced the constant pressure of knowing that every battle, every decision, could bring his army closer to victory, or to ruin. Life in an officer's tent, though relatively more comfortable, is not without its challenges. The officers often had to endure long hours of paperwork, endless strategy meetings, and the nagging worry of what the next battle would bring. They were constantly required to make decisions based not only on military strategy but on the welfare of their men. While the common soldier might take a few moments to rest by the fire, officers could rarely afford such luxuries. Their minds were always occupied with tactics, logistics, and the broader picture of the war. The weight of their responsibilities was ever present, and the guilt of the losses suffered by their soldiers could be a heavy burden to bear. The contrast between Union and Confederate officers can also be seen in their backgrounds. Many Union officers came from a more diverse range of social classes. Some were career soldiers, having graduated from military academies like West Point, but others were self-made men, rising through the ranks due to their leadership abilities rather than noble birth. In contrast, many of the Confederate officers came from wealthy, aristocratic families. They were often plantation owners, sons of privilege who had been groomed for leadership from an early age. This social divide was significant, not just in terms of wealth, but in the cultural values they held. The Southern officers tended to view themselves as defenders of a way of life, while the Union officers were driven by a sense of duty to preserve the Union, despite the internal divisions that threatened to tear it apart. You can imagine the Union officers, often tasked with maintaining control over a large, sprawling army, constantly on the move, their lives defined by the shifting lines of battle. Their camps were larger, with more resources at their disposal, but they, too, faced their own difficulties. The Union generals had the advantage of superior resources, more men, more supplies, but their soldiers were often spread out over vast distances, which presented logistical challenges of its own. Meals were often a matter of what could be found, and the constant movement left little time for rest or recuperation. On the other hand, Confederate officers, with fewer resources and manpower, faced an entirely different set of challenges. Their camps were often smaller, and supplies were scarce. The men under their command were often exhausted, and the food was sometimes nothing more than scraps. The officers, though better off than their soldiers, were still deeply affected by the hardships around them. Many had family members in the South, fighting the same war, and the pressure of knowing that their loved ones were suffering made their own burdens even heavier. The officers also had a unique role in maintaining the morale of their troops. They were not just commanders but symbols of hope, strength, and determination. When they rode through the camp, their presence was a reminder of the larger purpose of the war. But that symbolism could also be a double-edged sword. If the men under their command lost faith in their leadership, the entire army could falter. For the officers, this pressure was constant. They had to inspire confidence in the men they led, even when their own faith in victory wavered. Their duties went beyond strategy and logistics. They were also tasked with keeping the spirits of their soldiers intact. The social world of the officer corps was distinct from that of the soldiers. While the men on the front lines were huddled together in the mud, the officers were often afforded moments of quiet reflection and the opportunity to write letters home. They communicated with families, wrote reports, and, when possible, engaged in small comforts like reading or playing cards. But even these small pleasures were tainted by the constant knowledge that the war was far from over, and the stakes were growing higher with each passing day. And then, of course, there were the personal losses. Many officers, like their soldiers, received word that a loved one had fallen in battle, and the grief they felt was just as profound. General Grant, for example, faced not only the loss of comrades but the emotional toll of seeing his army, time and again, lose men to the horrors of war. The officers, too, suffered the same human losses, though their positions often required them to maintain an outward composure, to remain unflinching in the face of death. The sound of distant drums or the soft murmur of soldiers' voices fades away as you imagine the life of a prisoner of war, an existence stripped of freedom, filled with uncertainty, fear, and suffering. Life behind the barbed wire, or in makeshift prison camps, was a world apart from the life you lead in the trenches. For both Union and Confederate soldiers, capture meant more than just being taken from the battlefield. It was a fate that brought with it its own unique horrors. In the days of the Civil War, when men were taken as prisoners, they were often moved to overcrowded, poorly maintained camps. The Confederate and Union camps alike were notorious for their squalid conditions. Imagine being taken from the chaos of battle, your weapon taken from your hand, your freedom stripped away. The march to the prison camp is a quiet, grim journey. Perhaps the only sounds are the heavy steps of those around you, and the occasional shout of the guards. When you arrive at the camp, you are greeted not by a sense of safety, but by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The ground beneath you is muddy and uneven, and you are herded into a pen with dozens, even hundreds, of other soldiers. You sleep not on soft beds but on the cold, damp earth. The walls of the camp, if there are any, are little more than crude fences or thin sheets of canvas that offer no real protection from the elements. Overcrowding is the rule, not the exception. Space is scarce, and the men around you are not strangers, but fellow soldiers, now bound by their shared misfortune. The air, thick with the smell of sweat, decay, and the stench of disease, is oppressive. In the camps, disease spreads quickly, malaria, dysentery, and pneumonia claiming the lives of prisoners with disturbing regularity. The conditions are made worse by the scarcity of food. Rations, if they are provided at all, are small and inadequate, often consisting of meager portions of stale bread or spoiled meat. Water is scarce, and when it is available, it is often tainted with filth or disease. Many prisoners, unable to stomach what little food is given to them, suffer from malnutrition, their bodies weakening with each passing day. And yet, despite the physical toll, it is the psychological suffering of captivity that is most profound. The uncertainty of your future gnaws at you. Will you ever be freed? Will you survive this ordeal? The weight of waiting is constant. You may wonder what awaits you, perhaps an exchange between armies or, even worse, the brutal fate of not surviving the next sickness that sweeps through the camp. The guards, often indifferent, patrol the perimeter, but they are just another symbol of the powerlessness that now defines your existence. Both Union and Confederate camps were notorious for their inhumane conditions, but the experiences differed on each side. The Confederate prison camps, especially the notorious Andersonville prison in Georgia, became infamous for their overcrowding and the lack of provisions. With a prison population that far exceeded the camp's capacity, the conditions in Andersonville were dire. There was little food to be had, and the disease-ridden waters of the nearby creek were undrinkable. Prisoners often resorted to digging shallow graves to bury their comrades, and the only respite came in the form of a brief, fleeting moment of escape into death. In contrast, the Union prisoner of war camps were not much better. Camp Douglas in Illinois and Elmira in New York were notorious for their overcrowding and deplorable conditions. Despite the Union's superior resources, the camps were still struggling to accommodate the large number of prisoners, and the lack of provisions meant that many soldiers were forced to suffer from malnutrition. The air in these camps, like the Confederate ones, was filled with the smell of sickness and despair. Disease ran rampant, and the mortality rate for prisoners on both sides of the conflict remained tragically high. Prisoners, regardless of which side they fought for, faced more than just the threat of disease and starvation. There was also the constant fear of violence. In some camps, particularly early in the war, prisoners were exchanged, but as the conflict dragged on, such exchanges became rarer. The growing animosity between the Union and Confederacy meant that prisoners, especially those captured in large numbers, were often left to languish in camps for months, even years. Life in the prison camps also brought with it the brutality of limited resources. Guards were often ill-trained or cruel, and escapes were met with harsh punishment. The stark reality was that prisoners could not afford to be weak. Any sign of illness or vulnerability could mark you for death, either by starvation, disease, or the harshness of the prison's oppressive daily routine. Yet, even amidst the suffering, there were moments of solidarity and camaraderie. Prisoners shared what little they had, scraps of food, clothing, or the rare letter from home. They formed small communities within the camps, trying to maintain a semblance of normality in a world turned upside down. This shared experience of suffering became, for many, a bond stronger than the uniforms they wore. Whether Union or Confederate, they were all soldiers caught in the same unrelenting war, bound together by the common fate of being prisoners. Your thoughts may turn to one of the most iconic figures of the Civil War, General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate Army. To imagine his life is to consider a man caught between duty, honor, and the crushing weight of a cause that would ultimately fail. Lee's personal struggles, his deep commitment to his family, his sense of honor, and his belief in the Confederate cause, are intertwined with the fate of the Confederacy itself. His story is one of quiet dignity, steadfast determination, and the painful realization that the dream of a Confederacy would eventually collapse under the weight of war. Lee's life, before the war, had been one of military success and personal respect. Born into a family with a long history of military service, Robert E. Lee was well educated and trained at West Point, where he graduated second in his class, with no demerits. His early career in the U.S. Army was marked by discipline, bravery, and a growing reputation as a leader who could be relied upon in times of crisis. He fought with distinction in the Mexican-American War, where his skills as a military tactician began to shine. His ability to navigate difficult terrain and manage his troops in challenging circumstances earned him the respect of his peers and superiors. Yet, as the Civil War loomed on the horizon, Lee's path would take a dramatic turn. In the early days of the war, when Southern states began seceding, Lee faced a profound moral and personal dilemma. As a Virginian, he had strong ties to the South, but he also had a deep sense of loyalty to the Union. It was not a decision Lee made lightly. In fact, he initially resisted calls to join the Confederate cause. In a letter to his wife, he expressed his anguish over the situation, saying, "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children." Ultimately, it was his loyalty to Virginia that led him to take up arms for the Confederacy. But even as he accepted the role of commander of the Confederate Army, Lee's heart was torn. He was fighting not for an ideal of rebellion, but to defend his home and his way of life. His duty, his honor, and his sense of duty to his family were what drove him, but there was always a quiet personal conflict in his soul, a conflict between the love for his homeland and the knowledge that he was fighting for a cause that was, in the end, doomed to fail. Lee's early successes in the war seemed to validate his decision. His tactical genius shone through in battles like the 7 Days Battles and the Second Battle of Bull Run. He had an uncanny ability to inspire his troops, to lead them with a quiet strength that contrasted sharply with the more boisterous personalities of other military leaders. He became a symbol of the Confederate cause, a figure of dignity and unwavering resolve. But as the war continued, Lee's challenges mounted. The Confederacy was fighting a war of attrition, one in which it was increasingly clear that the Union's resources, population, and industry would outlast the South's. Lee faced not only the physical toll of the war but also the mounting pressure of keeping his army together despite overwhelming odds. The South had few resources to draw from, and Lee's men were often underfed, ill-equipped, and weary. The constant strain of trying to maintain his army's morale while facing resource shortages weighed heavily on him. In many ways, Lee's personal struggles mirrored the collapse of the Confederate dream. As the Union armies pressed further into Southern territory, Lee's confidence began to wane. His once dominant forces were increasingly outnumbered and outgunned. Yet, he continued to fight with a determination that became legendary. The Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, where Lee's forces were decisively defeated, marked a turning point in the war, and from that point on, it was clear that the Confederacy was on the defensive. Lee's dreams of a Confederate victory began to crumble. Despite this, Lee's resolve did not falter. His soldiers, weary and often ill-equipped, continued to follow him, drawn by his unwavering belief in their cause. But the toll of the war, both on Lee's personal life and his leadership, was evident. His beloved home state of Virginia was being ravaged by war, and the emotional strain began to show. Lee's letters to his wife, Mary, reveal his exhaustion, both physical and emotional. He wrote to her in 1864, "I have been through much and am worn out, but I will not surrender." As the war dragged on, Lee's health began to deteriorate. The constant stress, the weight of leadership, and the toll of the war were visible on his face, in his eyes. His once imposing figure grew gaunt and weary. But he never wavered in his commitment to his men, to the Confederacy, and to his ideals. Even as it became apparent that the war could not be won, Lee remained steadfast, unwilling to give up the fight until the very end. The final act of Lee's story came in April 1865, as Union forces, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, closed in on his army at Appomattox Court House. The Confederacy had been crushed, its resources exhausted, and its morale shattered. Lee, knowing that further resistance was futile, made the fateful decision to surrender to Grant. The terms of surrender were generous. Grant allowed Lee's men to return to their homes, keeping their horses and personal belongings, a gesture that reflected both men's desire to end the war with dignity. Lee's surrender marked the end of the Confederacy, but it also marked the beginning of the South's long process of rebuilding. For Lee, the end of the war was not just the loss of a cause, it was the collapse of a way of life. His dreams of a new nation, one founded on the principles of the Confederacy, had been shattered. But in his surrender, Lee showed a quiet dignity, acknowledging that the war was over and that it was time to rebuild, not just the South, but the nation as a whole. The war, though distant in time, lingers in the stories we still tell, the stories of battle, of loss, of sacrifice. But some stories remain unresolved, shrouded in mystery and echoing with unanswered questions. Among the most haunting and poignant of these stories are the countless soldiers who fought in the Civil War, only to disappear without a trace. Their bodies, once strewn across battlefields, left behind no name, no record, only the remains of lives cut short. Imagine the battlefield after the clash of armies has faded, the smoke of gunpowder still lingering in the air, and the ground littered with the bodies of soldiers, both Union and Confederate. In the chaos of war, identification was not always possible. Soldiers who fell in battle were often left behind, their bodies unclaimed, their names lost in the rush of conflict. As the battles raged on, many soldiers were buried hastily or not at all, their resting places unknown, their identities erased by time. For years after the war, families across the nation were left with the uncertainty of whether their loved ones had lived or died, where they had fallen, or if they had been buried in an unmarked grave. Letters went unanswered, and the soldiers who did return were often unrecognizable, their bodies and minds scarred by the horrors of war. But for many, there was no return at all. And it is these missing soldiers, those whose bodies were never found or identified, that haunt the landscape of Civil War memory. One of the most haunting mysteries surrounds the unidentified bodies of soldiers who died in battle and were buried in mass graves, many of which were unmarked or lost to time. The nature of warfare, with its brutal intensity and hurried pace, often meant that soldiers were buried without ceremony, sometimes in shallow graves that could easily be overlooked. At the Battle of Gettysburg, for example, the number of dead was so great that many were hastily buried in mass graves, their identities obscured by the overwhelming scale of the conflict. In the chaos of war, soldiers could become anonymous, their bodies mingling in the earth, their names forever lost. The discovery of these mass graves is one of the most poignant aspects of the post-war effort to honor the fallen. In the years following the war, archaeologists and historians began to uncover these forgotten graves, and with them, the stories of the soldiers buried within. Yet, despite the advances in forensic techniques and the use of DNA testing, many of these soldiers remain unidentified, their stories lost to the sands of time. There is something deeply moving about the thought of these men, who once had names, faces, and lives, now reduced to mere numbers in a ledger or forgotten fragments of history. In some cases, families have fought for years to identify the remains of loved ones. Some have found solace in the discovery of their ancestors' graves, while others have been left with nothing but the remains of a man who, though a son, a father, or a brother, remains a nameless casualty of war. In some instances, the remains of soldiers have been identified using advanced forensic techniques, bringing closure to families who had long since given up hope. But for every soldier whose name has been restored to the annals of history, there are countless others who remain faceless, their bodies lying beneath the earth, their stories untold. But beyond the physical remains, there is another layer of mystery surrounding the Civil War soldiers, one that touches on the more spectral side of history. Over the years, Gettysburg and other battlefields have become the focus of countless ghost stories, legends of wandering spirits who refused to leave the land where they fell. Soldiers, both Union and Confederate, are said to haunt these fields, their restless spirits wandering the terrain, searching for peace. The most famous of these ghostly legends is the story of the ghost soldiers of Gettysburg, figures seen in the distance, draped in tattered uniforms, marching silently across the fields as if caught in some eternal loop of battle. The eerie sounds of distant cannon fire or the cries of soldiers have been reported by visitors and historians alike, adding a layer of supernatural mystery to the already haunted legacy of the battlefield. One particularly chilling tale is that of the soldier's grave at Gettysburg, where, according to legend, the ghost of a Confederate soldier has been seen standing guard over an unmarked grave. The figure is said to be dressed in ragged Confederate gray, staring silently into the distance, a sentinel who has never been able to leave his post. Whether these ghostly tales are simply the result of the human mind's tendency to fill the silence with stories, or whether there is something more to the haunting presence of these soldiers, remains an open question. Some believe that the spirits of the fallen soldiers are tied to the land, unable to rest because their names were never known, their lives never properly honored. Their spirits are thought to walk the fields, forever searching for recognition, for their families, for closure. The idea of restless souls searching for peace resonates deeply, as it reflects the very real human cost of the war. The soldiers who gave their lives but left behind only empty graves and unanswered questions. The involvement of African American soldiers. For them, the war was not only about survival or loyalty. It was about something much deeper, something that transcended the battlefield. It was about freedom, equality, and the struggle for human dignity. The stories of these men, who fought for both the Union and the Confederacy, are a testament to the power of hope, resilience, and the enduring belief in the possibility of a better life. Imagine yourself as an African American soldier, standing shoulder to shoulder with men of every color and creed, your uniform a symbol of your fight for freedom. Before the war, many African Americans were bound by the chains of slavery, living lives of oppression and hardship. But as the war progressed, so too did the role of African Americans in the fight for the Union. By 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army officially opened its ranks to African American soldiers, calling them to arms in the fight against the Confederacy. The decision to allow African Americans to serve in the Union Army was a turning point in the war. Initially, many were hesitant to accept them, seeing them only as laborers rather than soldiers. But as the Union's need for troops grew and the desire for a decisive end to the war became clear, African American soldiers were welcomed into the fold. By the end of the war, over 180,000 African Americans had enlisted in the Union Army, fighting not only for the preservation of the Union but for the abolition of slavery and the promise of a future where they would be free and equal. These soldiers, though often facing the same brutal conditions as their white counterparts, were treated differently in many respects. They were often assigned to support roles, building fortifications, guarding prisoners, or serving as cooks and laborers, rather than being placed in combat units. Yet, despite the discrimination they faced, African American soldiers proved themselves to be capable, brave, and willing to fight for a cause that was greater than themselves. In combat, African American soldiers faced particular challenges. Not only were they fighting the Confederate forces, but they also had to contend with prejudice and racism from within the Union Army. Many white soldiers and officers believed that African Americans were inferior, and their abilities were often underestimated. But African American soldiers fought with a courage that belied the prejudices of their time. They proved their worth at battles such as the Battle of Fort Wagner in 1863, where the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, one of the most famous African American regiments, led a courageous charge against Confederate defenses. Though the battle ended in heavy losses, including the death of their commanding officer, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the bravery of the 54th Massachusetts became a symbol of African American valor. The treatment of African American soldiers by the Confederacy was equally brutal. For Confederate leaders, the sight of African American soldiers fighting for the Union was a threat not only to the Confederate cause but also to the very social order they had built on the institution of slavery. When African American soldiers were captured by the Confederacy, they were often treated with disdain and cruelty. Many were sent to prison camps, where the conditions were as harsh as those faced by white prisoners. Some were even executed or enslaved again. The Confederacy's refusal to treat African American soldiers as prisoners of war reflected the deep-rooted racial animosity that fueled the conflict. Life for African American soldiers in the Union Army was not without its own hardships. Though they were promised pay equal to that of white soldiers, they were initially paid less and had to endure the stigma of being seen as inferior soldiers. For many African Americans, the very act of enlisting in the Army was an act of defiance against a lifetime of enslavement. To wear the uniform of the Union was not just a military commitment, it was a personal declaration of their desire for freedom and equality. And even as they fought, they were constantly aware that their freedom was still uncertain. The war, after all, was not just about winning battles. It was about securing a future where they could be free, not just from slavery, but from the oppressive systems that had held them back for so long. But the contributions of African American soldiers went beyond the battlefield. In addition to their military service, they played an essential role in the Union's victory. Many African American soldiers helped to build the infrastructure of the Army, constructing fortifications, repairing railroads, and providing valuable labor that allowed the Union Army to function. Their service in these roles was vital to the war effort, though it was often overlooked or undervalued. Still, African Americans continued to serve, driven by the belief that their participation in the war would ultimately bring about their freedom. As the war drew to a close, and the Union emerged victorious, the role of African American soldiers in the conflict was acknowledged. The end of the war, and the subsequent passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, marked a new chapter in American history. The African American soldiers who had fought for freedom were instrumental in shaping the future of the nation, though the journey toward true equality was far from over. For soldiers, both Union and Confederate, the fear of death was not a distant, abstract concept. It was an ever-present reality, one that shadowed every moment, every march, and every battle. The constant fear of death did not come only from the guns of the enemy, but from the ever-looming threat of disease, the slow decay of the body, and the psychological toll that such a brutal conflict exacted on the mind and spirit. Imagine yourself, a soldier in the midst of war, feeling the weight of your rifle in your hands, the constant ache in your muscles from the relentless marching. Your uniform is worn thin, the fabric frayed and stained with dirt and sweat. The days blend into one another, marked only by the rhythm of marching and the occasional clash with enemy forces. But the true terror, the one that lingers in the background of every soldier's mind, is the fear of what will come when the bullets have stopped flying and the battles have ended. You are surrounded by men who, like you, are driven by duty, but also by a constant, gnawing anxiety, the knowledge that at any moment, death could find them. The battlefield is filled with the sounds of cannon fire and rifle shots. But even when the fighting stops, the threat remains. It is the fear of sudden death, the knowledge that a single shot could end your life, that looms largest. And yet, it is the uncertainty of when or how it will come that keeps you on edge, never truly at peace. But death in war does not come only in the form of bullets. Disease, too, is a constant threat. The conditions in the camps are harsh, overcrowded, unsanitary, and filled with the stench of decay. The soldiers live side by side in cramped tents, their bodies pressed together in close quarters, with little protection from the elements. The food is sparse, often stale or spoiled, and the water, if it can be found, is often contaminated. In these conditions, disease spreads quickly. Malaria, dysentery, and typhoid fever run rampant, claiming the lives of many soldiers who never even saw the front lines. You might imagine yourself lying in a tent, your body aching from the strain of battle, but now it is the fever that grips you. Your skin is hot to the touch, and every breath feels like it is drawn through thick, oppressive air. The body, weakened by hunger, exposure, and the relentless march, is vulnerable to the diseases that sweep through the camp. There are no doctors to tend to your needs, only fellow soldiers who are just as ill as you are, struggling to survive the same ordeal. Your chances of survival, once slim, seem even more distant now. The fear of death by disease is just as real as the fear of death by enemy fire, and perhaps even more insidious. As the days stretch on, you can hear the sounds of others suffering nearby, men coughing, groaning, or calling out in pain. The camp is filled with the sick, their suffering echoing through the tents. Some soldiers, weak from illness, lie on the ground, too exhausted to even move, while others crawl in search of whatever water or food might be left. The fear of dying in this way, slowly, without a fight, without glory, is one of the most bitter fears of war. It is a death that comes not in an instant, but over days or weeks, wearing away at the body and the spirit. But beyond the physical toll, there is the psychological toll of war, a toll that is just as devastating, though often invisible. The constant exposure to violence, the sight of comrades falling beside you, the overwhelming knowledge that your survival is a matter of chance rather than skill, leaves deep scars on the mind. The emotional weight of battle, the fear of death, and the grief of losing friends and comrades day after day, takes its toll on the soldier's psyche. The soldiers you march alongside are no longer just your comrades in arms. They are witnesses to your suffering, your fear, and your loss. And you, too, bear witness to theirs. Perhaps you see the faraway looks in the eyes of those around you. Perhaps you have seen the sudden breakdowns, the trembling hands, the men who speak of home in a voice that cracks under the weight of their emotions. Some soldiers, unable to bear the strain, retreat inward, unable to cope with the stress of the constant threat of death. The psychological scars of war are deep and long-lasting. The trauma of losing so many friends, of seeing so much bloodshed, stays with you long after the war has ended. The fear of death, the suffering from disease, and the psychological toll of battle are constant companions for soldiers. There is no escaping the reality of war. Even in moments of respite, when you find a moment of peace, there is the knowledge that it may be fleeting. The battle may not be over. The threat of death may not be gone. And even if the war ends, the trauma of what you've seen, what you've lived through, may never leave you. But there is a certain strength that arises in the face of all this fear. The soldiers, though haunted by death and disease, continue to march, to fight, to endure. They have no choice but to carry on, to push through the fear, to keep moving forward. The resilience of the human spirit in the face of such hardship is one of the most profound aspects of war. In the end, it is not the bullets that define a soldier's courage, but the quiet endurance, the ability to face death, not just with fear, but with a steady resolve. You might think about the women who, despite not taking up arms in the traditional sense, played an invaluable role in the Civil War. Their contributions were no less vital or courageous, and their stories, often overlooked in the grand narrative of war, are filled with strength, resourcefulness, and a determination to make a difference in a world defined by conflict. Imagine the bustling field hospitals, where the sounds of battle can still be heard faintly in the distance, and the air is thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and antiseptic. Here, the women who served as nurses worked tirelessly, often under harsh conditions, to tend to the wounded. These women, many of whom had no formal medical training, became the backbone of the medical efforts on both the Union and Confederate sides. They cared for the soldiers, offering whatever comfort they could in a place where suffering was omnipresent. They were not soldiers, but they were every bit as brave as the men who fought in the trenches. One of the most famous of these women was Clara Barton, who served as a nurse during the Civil War and later founded the American Red Cross. Barton's determination and compassion were evident as she risked her life to deliver medical supplies to soldiers on the front lines. Her work helped to redefine the role of women in times of war, proving that women, too, could stand strong in the face of overwhelming adversity. She was one of many who defied the traditional expectations of what a woman could or should do, and through her actions, she became a symbol of the resilience and courage of women during the war. But the role of women during the Civil War was not confined to the hospital tent. Many women, like the famous Harriet Tubman, served as spies or scouts for the Union Army, using their positions to gather intelligence that could make the difference between victory and defeat. Tubman, an escaped slave, risked her life time and again, leading missions to free enslaved people behind enemy lines and delivering critical information to Union forces. Her courage, like that of many others, was unmatched, and her actions in the war helped pave the way for the eventual abolition of slavery in the United States. Even more remarkable were the women who, disguised as men, took up arms to fight for the cause they believed in. Though women were not officially allowed to enlist in the military, some found ways to disguise themselves and join the ranks. They cut their hair, bound their chests, and donned military uniforms, assuming false identities to fight in the war. Their reasons for enlisting varied. Some sought adventure, others were driven by a deep commitment to the Union or Confederate cause, and some simply could not bear the thought of leaving their loved ones behind to fight alone. One such woman was Sarah Edmonds, who enlisted in the Union Army under the name Franklin Thompson. Edmonds served as a nurse, but when the opportunity arose, she took on the role of a soldier, participating in several key battles. She even served as a spy, gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable to the Union Army. Like many others who served in disguise, Edmonds risked not only her life but her identity. If discovered, she would have faced severe punishment, but she pressed on, knowing that her actions were part of something much larger than herself. In addition to their roles on the front lines, many women also contributed by organizing fundraisers, sewing uniforms, and providing supplies to the troops. These women may not have been in the heat of battle, but their efforts were no less crucial. They provided the materials and resources that enabled the armies to continue fighting, often working behind the scenes to support the war effort in ways that were essential to its success. As you sit quietly, the crackling of the fire reminding you of the passage of time, it's easy to imagine the lives of these women, how they navigated a world that told them their place was at home, not on the battlefield. Yet they answered a higher call, stepping into roles that were once unimaginable for women, proving their worth through their courage and determination. They faced the same horrors of war as the men did, witnessing the same suffering, fear, and loss, but they did so without the recognition they deserved, their contributions often lost to history. The bravery of women in the Civil War reshaped the role of women in American society. Their actions during the war challenged preconceived notions about gender and duty, and their service laid the groundwork for the women's rights movements that would come in the decades that followed. Though the war itself left deep scars on the nation, it also planted the seeds for change. Women who had once been relegated to the domestic sphere now stood shoulder to shoulder with men, showing that their strength, resolve, and resilience could not be confined by the limits of societal expectations. Think of these women, nurses, spies, soldiers in disguise, who fought not with guns, but with their courage, their wits, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than themselves. Their stories may not have been written in the history books of their time, but they have lived on, carried by those who remember their contributions, and their legacy continues to inspire. The Confederate States, desperate for resources and funds to sustain their rebellion, often turned to unconventional, sometimes illicit means to secure money and supplies. Stories of stolen goods, hidden caches of gold, and lost fortunes are woven into the fabric of the war's final chapters, and they have persisted in the years since, fueling rumors and legends about what was lost in the desperate days of the Confederacy's collapse. Imagine yourself, a Confederate soldier, fighting not just for a cause but for the very survival of your army. Supplies are scarce, and every battle is not just a fight for territory but a struggle to secure the resources needed to keep fighting. The Confederacy's economy was built on the back of a plantation system reliant on slavery, and with the Union blockade cutting off crucial supplies from abroad, the South struggled to maintain any semblance of financial stability. In this context, the Confederate government was forced to look elsewhere, resorting to all manner of tactics to fund the war. One of the most infamous stories of lost Confederate treasure comes from the final days of the Confederacy. As General Robert E. Lee's army was cornered and the Union forces closed in, Confederate leaders, fearing the loss of the South's gold reserves, made a desperate attempt to hide their wealth. The Confederacy had accumulated significant amounts of gold and silver over the years, but as the war turned against them, they feared that if the Union discovered their treasure, it could deal a fatal blow to their already fragile financial situation. As the Confederacy's final days approached, Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his cabinet began to secretly move their wealth, hoping to safeguard it from the advancing Union troops. The exact details of the treasure's journey are shrouded in mystery, but it is believed that Davis and his associates ordered the gold to be hidden in a series of secret locations, including remote areas in Georgia, North Carolina, and even Virginia. The wealth was said to have included gold coins, silver, and various other forms of currency, essentially, the last financial lifeline of the Confederacy. As you sit by your campfire, you might imagine the desperation in those final days. The Confederate leaders, scrambling to protect what remained of their nation's wealth. With Union forces pressing in from all sides, it's easy to picture the frantic attempts to transport the gold and other valuable resources to safety. Some accounts suggest that the treasure was hidden in caves, buried in remote woods, or hidden in the attics of private homes. But despite these efforts, much of it was lost. Some speculate that the treasure was never fully hidden, that it was intercepted by Union soldiers who had caught wind of the plan, or that it was lost in the chaos of the Confederacy's collapse. And yet, rumors of the treasure's existence persisted long after the war ended. In the years that followed, treasure hunters, historians, and even curious civilians searched the forests and hills of the South, hoping to uncover the lost wealth of the Confederacy. Various expeditions were launched, some claiming to have found pieces of the treasure, gold coins, Confederate banknotes, and other artifacts from the war, but no one has ever definitively located the treasure in its entirety. Some believe it lies buried somewhere in the mountains of Georgia, while others suggest it was lost in the swamps of South Carolina or hidden in the caves near Lynchburg, Virginia. Despite numerous attempts to find it, the treasure remains elusive, fueling countless legends and theories about where it might be. Some say that it's still out there, waiting to be discovered, while others believe that it was never hidden at all, simply a legend spun by soldiers desperate for hope in their final days. But the allure of the Confederate treasure continues to capture the imagination of historians and treasure hunters alike, as the mystery of what was lost remains unsolved. The fascination with Confederate treasure is not just about gold or silver, it's about the symbolism of what it represents. The treasure, if found, would be more than a mere financial boon. It would be a symbol of a lost cause, of a rebellion that once fought valiantly but ultimately crumbled under the weight of history. For those who search for it, the treasure represents a connection to the past, a way to grasp hold of something tangible from a time that has long since passed. And yet, for the soldiers who fought, the treasure was not what defined the war. They fought for ideals, for their homes, and for the survival of their families, not for gold or riches. The war left scars that could not be hidden or buried, and in the end, the Confederate treasure became just another casualty of a conflict that left much more than gold in its wake. In the South, where the echoes of plantations and the hum of cotton mills filled the air, slavery was not just a practice. It was the foundation upon which the Southern economy was built. And yet, as the war raged on, it was clear that slavery was not only the economic engine of the Confederacy. It was the issue that defined the very heart of the conflict. Imagine yourself on a sprawling plantation in the South, the air thick with the scent of earth and cotton, the sounds of workers moving through fields, picking the precious crop that fuels the Southern economy. The plantation, with its large houses, wide porches, and neatly manicured lawns, is a world apart from the harsh realities of the soldiers at the front lines. Here, the men and women who own the land, often from wealthy families, enjoy a life of privilege and leisure, built upon the labor of enslaved people. Slavery in the South was integral to the economy. The vast majority of wealth in the Confederate States was tied to agriculture, particularly cotton and tobacco farming. Slaves, seen not as people but as property, were forced to work long hours in the fields, picking crops under the hot southern sun. Their labor supported the thriving cotton industry, which was the backbone of the South's economy. The wealth generated by these crops funded the lifestyles of the elite, while the enslaved people who worked the fields lived under constant fear, stripped of their humanity and subjected to brutal conditions. The role of slavery in the war was not only an economic one but also a deeply political and moral issue. As the war progressed, the question of slavery's future became inseparable from the fate of the Confederacy. The South, under the leadership of men like Jefferson Davis, viewed slavery as both a cornerstone of their way of life and an essential economic asset. The Southern states fought to preserve slavery, believing that without it, their agrarian economy would collapse, and their social order would unravel. For the wealthy elites, slavery was not just a means of labor. It was a symbol of their power, their status, and their control over the land. They saw themselves as the stewards of a system that had been in place for centuries, one that they believed was necessary for the economic prosperity of the region. Yet, even as the war wore on, their support of the system would become more tenuous. The economic hardships of the war began to take their toll, and the resources of the South were stretched to their limits. While the plantation owners lived in relative comfort, their lives, too, were disrupted by the war. The battlefields in Virginia and Georgia were not the only places where hardship was felt. Many plantation homes were converted into hospitals, and the threat of Union forces encroaching on Southern land loomed large. In contrast, for the enslaved people who labored on these plantations, the war offered a rare opportunity for change. As Union forces advanced through Southern territory, many enslaved people took the opportunity to escape. Some fled to Union lines, hoping for freedom, while others found refuge in camps set up by the Union Army. These individuals, once bound by the chains of slavery, now faced the unknown, the uncertainty of a future that was both terrifying and liberating. The Union Army, although often unprepared to deal with the influx of enslaved people, began to offer asylum to those who could make it behind their lines, making the question of slavery a matter of national importance. The Southern economy, already struggling under the weight of war, was further weakened by the loss of slave labor. As the Union Army gained ground, the South lost its most valuable resource, its human workforce. With fewer enslaved people available to work the fields, many Southern plantations were unable to produce enough crops to sustain the war effort. The lack of agricultural production led to widespread food shortages, and the South's ability to sustain its army became increasingly difficult. The Confederacy was, quite literally, fighting a war on two fronts, against the Union forces and against the economic collapse that resulted from its reliance on slavery. In the Confederate government, the reality of war began to set in. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, understood that slavery was essential to the survival of the Southern cause. Yet, as the war continued and casualties mounted, even Davis began to realize that the institution could no longer be protected without fundamentally altering the very fabric of Southern society. The desperation of the Confederate situation was reflected in the way the leadership began to treat enslaved people. Some Confederate generals and officials began to consider arming enslaved people to fight for the Confederacy in exchange for their freedom, a last-ditch effort to bolster their forces. But even as the South's elite fought to maintain their system of slavery, the Union, under President Abraham Lincoln, had begun to turn the war into a moral crusade. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. This shift in Union policy turned the war into more than just a fight for the preservation of the Union. It became a battle for the abolition of slavery itself. The proclamation did not free all enslaved people immediately, but it was a critical step toward ending the institution of slavery across the country. It also provided a moral imperative for Union soldiers, who now saw their fight not only as one to preserve the Union, but also to end the scourge of slavery. The war, once focused on the preservation of the Southern way of life, had become a struggle for freedom. The South, once so reliant on slavery, now faced the painful collapse of an economic system built on human suffering. The wealthy elite who had once felt secure in their power saw it slipping away. And for the enslaved people, the war marked both a time of peril and a time of hope for a future where they could live free, where they could finally experience the rights and freedoms that had long been denied to them. One of the darkest and most unsettling aspects of war, the grim reality of battlefield medicine. Unlike the sanitized world of modern hospitals, the medical practices of the Civil War were crude, born out of necessity and desperation, with soldiers often facing horrors not only from the enemy's bullets, but from the very hands that were supposed to heal them. Imagine yourself, a soldier, lying in a makeshift field hospital. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and the sharp scent of antiseptic, though in truth, there is little in the way of real cleanliness. The tents are overcrowded, and the wounded lie on rough wooden tables or the hard ground, waiting for care, often for hours or even days. The chaos of battle is still fresh in the air, and yet the real horrors of war, those that come after the battle, is what waits for you here. In the heat of battle, injuries were frequent and often fatal. Gunshot wounds, gaping and searing, were among the most common. A bullet could tear through muscle, bone, and tissue, and though soldiers might survive the initial impact, the real danger lay in infection. The lack of proper medical knowledge, the absence of antibiotics, and the scarcity of sterile instruments meant that soldiers were at risk of dying not from their wounds, but from the infections that followed. Gangrene spread rapidly, turning flesh black and decayed, and without proper sanitation, the wounds became breeding grounds for deadly bacteria. The lack of anesthesia in many battlefield hospitals compounded the suffering. In the heat of battle, there was little time for finesse. Soldiers who were badly wounded, often with shattered limbs, were at the mercy of the surgeons who worked quickly and with grim determination. The standard treatment for severe wounds, particularly those involving broken limbs, was amputation. For many soldiers, this was the only chance for survival. But the process was brutal. Without anesthesia to numb the pain, the surgeons worked with saws and knives, cutting through bone and tissue, as the soldiers, often fully conscious, endured unimaginable pain. You might imagine yourself, caught in the chaos of it all, waiting for your turn in the long line of wounded men. The screams of others who have gone before you fill the air, those who have already endured their fates, their amputations. You are offered little more than a swig of whiskey to dull the pain, but the reality of it is, there is no true relief. The surgeon, perhaps with blood-stained hands, moves from patient to patient, doing what he can with the limited resources at his disposal. Time seems to stretch on endlessly, the tension of waiting only growing with each agonizing minute. If you're lucky enough to survive the operation, the danger is far from over. Infection sets in quickly in a wound that isn't properly cleaned, and the lack of adequate medical supplies means that even a simple cut can become life-threatening. Soldiers often had to rely on the care of fellow comrades, who had no medical training, to tend to their wounds. Clean bandages were scarce, and sometimes soldiers had to make do with whatever they had available: old cloth, rags, or even their own shirts. The psychological toll of battlefield medicine cannot be understated. Soldiers who survived the physical horrors of battle often carried the scars of their experiences for the rest of their lives. The trauma of amputation, of watching fellow soldiers die from infection or disease, weighed heavily on those who lived through it. The fear of being sent to the operating table was as real as the fear of battle itself, and many soldiers, upon being wounded, were paralyzed by the thought of what might come next. The field hospitals themselves were overwhelmed with patients. There were too many wounded, and too few doctors. The medical staff, though dedicated, were often inexperienced and undertrained. The lack of proper equipment, sanitation, and medical supplies created an environment where death was a constant presence, even for those who had survived the battlefield itself. The surgeons and doctors were heroes in their own right, performing miracles when they could, but the reality was that many of the men who came to them seeking help did not leave with the hope of recovery. Instead, they left in coffins or in great pain, their lives marked by the horrors they had witnessed and endured. As you sit by the fire, the warmth and comfort of the night feel like a distant memory of a world far removed from the brutal realities of war. But in the field hospitals, there was no comfort, only the harsh, relentless demand for survival. The physical pain of the wounded was matched by the emotional pain of those who were left behind. For the soldiers, each injury, each wound, each amputation was a reminder of how fragile life was and how quickly it could be taken away. And yet, even amid the suffering, there was a sense of camaraderie. Soldiers who had been through similar trials shared their experiences, offering words of comfort or simple gestures of kindness. They became more than just soldiers in arms. They became brothers in hardship, bound together by the shared pain of war. The healing, though slow and often incomplete, took place not just through the efforts of doctors, but through the bond between men who had faced death together and had somehow survived. The soldiers who emerged from the war were forever changed, marked by the wounds of war, both visible and invisible. Their courage, their resilience, and their willingness to endure suffering became a part of the legacy of the Civil War, a legacy that shaped the future of a nation and of the men who fought to preserve it. One of the most controversial figures in the Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman. Known for his unwavering determination and his ruthless tactics, Sherman's March to the Sea is one of the defining moments of the war, embodying the brutality and strategic necessity of total war. His journey through Georgia, destroying not only military targets but also civilian infrastructure, marked a turning point in the conflict and is remembered with both admiration and disdain. Imagine yourself, a soldier in Sherman's army, marching through the thick, humid air of Georgia, the oppressive heat pressing down on you. The march, which began in November 1864, was unlike anything the soldiers had experienced before. It was not a campaign focused solely on the battlefield. There would be no grand engagements, no lines of soldiers facing off. Instead, Sherman's strategy was to break the South's will to fight, to strike at the heart of the Confederacy, not just its army, but its very lifeblood, its economy, its infrastructure, and its morale. The goal of Sherman's March to the Sea was simple yet devastating: move through the South, destroy everything of value to the Confederate war effort, and leave nothing but ashes in the wake of Union victory. The soldiers, numbering approximately 60,000, were tasked not just with fighting but with systematically tearing down the Confederate infrastructure. Railroads were destroyed, crops were burned, and factories were dismantled. Sherman's army moved through the countryside, leaving a trail of devastation as they made their way toward Savannah, Georgia, the heart of Confederate supply lines. As you march with Sherman's army, the destruction is relentless. The Confederates, though fighting desperately to protect their land, are unable to stop the Union forces. Sherman's troops have little mercy. They are instructed to take no prisoners, to destroy anything that could aid the Confederate cause. But the devastation goes beyond military targets. Homes are looted, fields are burned, and civilian lives are uprooted in the process. For those who lived in the path of Sherman's army, the march to the sea was a nightmare. Families were left without shelter, their livelihoods destroyed in the blink of an eye. For Sherman, this was not about cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was a calculated decision, a means to an end. Sherman believed that the South's infrastructure was its strength, and by cutting it off, the Confederacy would be forced to surrender. The destruction was meant to send a message to the Southern people. The war was no longer just a military conflict, it was an all-out assault on their way of life. In Sherman's eyes, breaking the spirit of the South was just as important as defeating its army. His logic was that a swift and decisive blow would shorten the war, saving lives in the long run by hastening the Confederacy's collapse. However, not everyone saw Sherman's actions as a necessary part of warfare. For many in the South, the march to the sea was a terrifying, senseless act of cruelty. The civilian population, who had little involvement in the fighting, felt the full brunt of Sherman's campaign. Families were torn apart, their homes destroyed, their fields burned to the ground. The once beautiful southern landscape was transformed into a desolate wasteland, and the psychological toll of Sherman's march was felt long after the Union forces left. For many, Sherman's name became synonymous with destruction and terror. Yet, Sherman's tactics were not without justification in the context of the war. The Confederacy, by 1864, was struggling to maintain its hold on the South. Its economy was collapsing, its manpower dwindling, and its ability to supply its armies was severely compromised. Sherman's march, while brutal, was part of a larger strategy to weaken the Confederacy from the inside out. By targeting civilians, Sherman hoped to break the resolve of the Southern population, forcing them to question the cost of continuing the war. As you march through the desolate fields of Georgia, you might feel a sense of disquiet. The land you now traverse is not just home to Confederate soldiers, but to civilians, farmers, families, who have had little choice in the fight. The destruction around you, burned houses, ruined crops, serves as a stark reminder of the war's true toll. The Union Army's victory is assured, but the price paid by both sides is immense. The Confederate civilians are left to rebuild from the ashes of what they once knew, while the Union soldiers march forward, their mission almost complete. Sherman's eventual arrival in Savannah in December 1864 marked the successful end of his march. The city, once a symbol of Confederate strength, was now in Union hands. For Sherman, the capture of Savannah was a victory, but the cost of that victory was undeniable. The South had been irreparably damaged, but the psychological scars of his march would linger for years. The devastation left behind would be felt by both sides, and for many in the South, Sherman's name would forever be tied to the destruction of their homeland. After the war, Sherman's march became a topic of intense debate. Some hailed him as a brilliant strategist, a man who understood the nature of total war and the need to break the Confederate resolve. Others condemned him for his ruthless tactics, accusing him of waging war against civilians. Sherman himself never expressed regret for his actions. He believed that the devastation he wrought was a necessary part of bringing the war to an end, even if it meant sacrificing the lives and livelihoods of countless innocents. Imagine walking across a Civil War battlefield, now peaceful and quiet, but beneath the surface, the land holds countless stories. The scars of war remain hidden beneath the soil, waiting to be uncovered by the hands of archaeologists who, through their meticulous work, bring history to light once more. These battlefields, which saw the fury of combat, now serve as time capsules, holding fragments of the past that reveal not just the events of the war but the human experiences woven into those moments of history. The battlefield, once a site of chaos, destruction, and death, now holds secrets in the form of musket balls, cannonballs, and remnants of soldiers' personal belongings. modern archaeology, with its advanced techniques and methods, is revealing a deeper understanding of the Civil War, one that extends beyond the written records and into the tangible objects left behind by those who fought. Every discovery, whether a rusty bayonet or a torn letter, adds another layer to the story, offering a glimpse into the lives of the soldiers who fought in those bloody clashes. Picture yourself walking through the fields of Gettysburg, the site of one of the most decisive battles of the war. The air is crisp, and the landscape is dotted with monuments, marking the places where men fought and fell. But beneath the well-trodden ground, there are still traces of those who once walked this land. Archaeologists, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools, have uncovered musket balls and pieces of artillery that had long been buried in the earth. These objects, now revealed, tell stories of the soldiers' experiences. The musket balls, scattered across the battlefield, speak of the fierce gunfire that tore through the ranks, the soldiers who took aim and fired under intense pressure, and the horrific casualties that resulted from each shot. One of the most poignant discoveries made by archaeologists in Civil War battlefields is the personal items left behind by soldiers. These objects, letters, buttons, coins, and pieces of clothing, are often found scattered in the soil, remnants of soldiers' lives that were interrupted by the violence of war. These items were once part of the soldiers' daily existence, and now, they are silent witnesses to the horrors they experienced. A letter torn and weathered might be found buried in the dirt, its ink faded but still legible in places. This letter, once sent to a loved one back home, may have been written in a soldier's final moments before he fell on the battlefield. Its contents, filled with expressions of love, hope, and longing, are now forever preserved in the soil. The excavation of these items, though simple in appearance, is a profound reminder of the humanity behind the war. The soldiers were not just faceless figures in uniform, but men with families, with hopes, and with dreams. The items they left behind speak to the personal side of the war, showing that even in the midst of battle, the soldiers carried pieces of home with them. The letters, photographs, and personal effects tell stories of the men who fought, not as generals or icons, but as sons, brothers, and fathers. Beyond the battlefield, modern archaeology is also revealing insights into the lives of soldiers in camp. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of soldiers' campsites, broken fragments of crockery, discarded food containers, and tools used for cooking and survival. These seemingly mundane objects paint a picture of daily life for the soldiers when they were not fighting. The soldiers, though embroiled in a monumental struggle, still found time for the simple comforts of life. They cooked their meals over fires, shared stories by the campfire, and maintained the bonds of friendship and camaraderie that helped them survive the hardships of war. In addition to uncovering the artifacts of soldiers, archaeologists have also worked to piece together the larger narrative of war by studying the battlefield's layout. The locations of trenches, fortifications, and the positioning of artillery reveal how the armies moved and fought. These discoveries help modern historians and archaeologists understand the strategies employed during battles, offering a clearer picture of how each side engaged with the other. They can see the positions of Union and Confederate troops and how the terrain affected the outcome of the battle. These insights help us understand not just the tactics used, but the suffering and sacrifices of the men who fought and died on these fields. The stories uncovered through archaeology are not just about the battles themselves, but about the lives of the soldiers, their experiences, their struggles, and their hopes. The objects discovered on Civil War battlefields provide a connection to those who fought, offering us a glimpse into their world. When a button from a soldier's uniform is uncovered, it is a small object, but it speaks volumes about the soldier's journey. It may have been lost or discarded during a march, but its rediscovery helps us understand the personal sacrifices made during the war. The battlefields, though now quiet and still, are filled with these reminders of the human cost of war. The work of archaeologists is not just about uncovering physical objects. It is about uncovering the stories of those who lived and died during the war. The discoveries made on Civil War battlefields are an essential part of understanding the true cost of the conflict, offering us a tangible connection to the past. As you sit beside the fire, the stories of these soldiers, their sacrifices, and their struggles echo in the stillness of the night. The land, though peaceful now, continues to carry the weight of history, and every artifact uncovered is a reminder of the lives that were once lived and lost in the chaos of war. As the last embers of the fire glow softly in the cool night, the haunting sounds of battle and the tumult of war seem far behind. The world, for now, is quiet. But the Civil War, with all its devastation, left scars that would last long after the final shots had been fired. Imagine yourself standing at the crossroads of history, where the war's end signals the beginning of an entirely new chapter for both the North and the South. The aftermath of war is always marked by a sense of uncertainty, but for those who lived through the Civil War, the weight of rebuilding, both physically and emotionally, seemed almost insurmountable. In the South, the effects of war were immediate and severe. The destruction was widespread. The fields that once teemed with crops were now burned and barren, the plantations that had powered the economy lay in ruins, and entire towns had been leveled. The loss of life was staggering. Nearly 300,000 Confederate soldiers died during the war, leaving families shattered and communities struggling to survive. The South's infrastructure was decimated, and the economy, once built on the labor of enslaved people, was left in tatters. There was no longer a reliance on slavery to fuel the agricultural system, and the plantations that had been the backbone of the Southern economy now stood empty, their wealth stripped away. For the Southern people, the end of the war brought not just the loss of a political cause, but the collapse of a way of life. The wealth that had once flowed from the cotton fields was now a distant memory. The aristocratic landowners who had once lived in large, beautiful homes were now left with nothing. The loss of slaves meant the loss of their labor force, and the task of rebuilding their plantations and their fortunes seemed impossible. And yet, as difficult as it was, many Southern families began to rebuild, though the process was slow and fraught with challenges. The old system had crumbled, but the people of the South, despite the odds, found ways to adapt. One of the most profound changes in post-war Southern society was the transformation of labor. With the abolition of slavery, a new system of labor emerged, though it was not without its own set of complications. Sharecropping became the primary means of agricultural work, where poor white farmers and former enslaved people worked the land in exchange for a portion of the crop. While it may have offered some opportunity for economic survival, the system often kept both groups in a cycle of debt and poverty. The South's economy continued to struggle for many years, as it sought to recover from the devastation of war while grappling with the profound social and economic changes brought about by emancipation. For the former enslaved people, the end of the war brought hope, but the reality of freedom was complicated. Many had been promised land and a future of equality, but in the years following the war, those promises often went unfulfilled. Freedmen's Bureau programs aimed to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, providing assistance with education, land, and legal rights. But these efforts were often undermined by both local and national political forces, and the racial discrimination that had been deeply entrenched in Southern society remained strong. The struggle for equality continued, long after the war's end, as African Americans fought not just for physical freedom but for the civil rights that had been denied to them for so long. In the North, the end of the war brought its own set of challenges, but in many ways, it marked the beginning of an era of unprecedented growth. The war had drained the country's resources, but it had also paved the way for industrialization and economic expansion. As the Southern economy faltered, the North began to industrialize at a rapid pace. The factories that had once produced weapons and supplies for the war effort were now repurposed for peacetime industries. Railroads expanded, steel production boomed, and new technologies transformed every aspect of American life. Cities grew as factories, mills, and coal mines offered new employment opportunities for many, and immigrants from around the world flooded into the North in search of work. This industrial growth was not without its costs. While the North became more prosperous, it also faced the challenges of urbanization. Cities became overcrowded, and working conditions in factories were often brutal. Long hours, low wages, and unsafe conditions were the norm for many industrial workers, leading to labor unrest and the rise of labor movements in the decades that followed. The North's economic transformation was accompanied by social tensions, as the wealth gap between the rich and the poor grew wider, and the issues of workers' rights and income inequality began to take center stage. For both the North and the South, the war had fundamentally changed the country. The South, with its agrarian economy in ruins, had to rebuild from the ground up, while the North experienced an industrial revolution that altered the nation's economic and social landscape. The war had been fought over slavery, but in its aftermath, it was clear that the question of equality and civil rights was far from settled. The Reconstruction period, which aimed to rebuild the Southern states and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society, was marred by political conflict and violence. The promise of freedom and equality for African Americans was challenged at every turn, and it would take many more decades of struggle before those promises would begin to be fully realized. As you sit by the fire, the quiet of the night around you, think about the long road of recovery that lay ahead for both the South and the North after the war. The wounds of the Civil War, both physical and psychological, would take years to heal, and the country's transformation from a divided, war-torn nation into a unified industrial power was a complex and difficult journey. The echoes of the war's aftermath continue to reverberate through American history, as the country faced the challenges of rebuilding, redefining itself, and living up to the ideals of liberty and equality that had driven the war in the first place.